Hey guys, tonight we step into the frozen world of medieval peasants, where the cold bites harder than a jealous neighbour, and every night feels like a battle with the very air itself. Imagine stepping out into the biting chill, your breath fogging like smoke, while frost crunches beneath your worn shoes. The cold isn't just a nuisance here, it's a relentless enemy that gnaws at your fingers, steals warmth from your bones, and threatens your very survival. You probably won't survive this without some serious grit and the kind of ingenuity that only desperation can inspire. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments. Let's see where you're watching this freeze fest from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through a medieval village in the dead of winter. The sun has long since disappeared, and an eerie stillness blankets the snow-covered rooftops. The cold is so fierce that it almost feels alive, creeping under your cloak, biting at exposed skin. Peasants don't have the luxury of modern heating. Their homes are barely better than glorified sheds. The cold here is a constant or unwelcome companion that shapes every action, every breath, every heartbeat. Historically, the Little Ice Age, a period roughly from the 14th to the 19th centuries, brought colder temperatures that often meant longer, harsher winters for these communities. Winters were not just a seasonal nuisance, they could be deadly. Food stores dwindled, water sources froze, and the biting chill caused illness and hardship. You get the sense that every layer of frost etched itself into their bones, that survival was less about thriving and more about simply making it through to spring. But here's a quirky tidbit: some peasants believed that the cold itself had a personality, almost a spirit, that could be bargained with or angered. So while you might curse the icy wind, they might whisper to it, leave offerings, or perform small rituals to keep it at bay. Historians still argue whether these rituals actually helped people survive, or if they were just the medieval version of crossed fingers. You stand by a frozen well, watching your breath turn into clouds that quickly vanish into the night. In this world, warmth is everything. It's not just comfort, it's life. And every small flame, every fur layer, every shared body heat is a rebellion against the dark cold. So, as you step deeper into this frozen night with me, remember, this isn't just a story about cold. It's about how humans fought to stay warm, to stay alive, in the face of a relentless winter that knew no mercy. You shuffle closer to the heart of the peasant's home, the hearth. The fire crackles low, sending shadows dancing along the soot-stained walls, but its warmth is a fragile luxury. In medieval cottages, the hearth isn't just a source of heat, it's the life centre, the village's pulse in miniature. You probably think it's all cosy logs and crackling flames, but in reality, that fire fills the whole house with smoke, turning noses black and lungs gritty. This is the smoky blanket the peasants wrapped themselves in to survive the coldest nights. Unlike modern fireplaces with chimneys designed to whisk smoke out, many early medieval homes had an open hearth right in the middle of the floor, and the smoke had nowhere to go but out through holes in the roof or the thatch. Imagine living with a constant haze that stings your eyes, makes it hard to breathe, and leaves your hair smelling like a campfire for days. Still, the hearth's warmth was worth every cough and tear. The fire wasn't just about survival, either. It was the social hub, the stage for stories, meals, and quiet moments of shared human connection You huddle around it with family and animals, sharing the rare comfort of heat. It's a rough, smoky embrace, but better than freezing alone in the dark. Here's an odd fact: some peasants added damp moss or green wood to the fire on purpose, knowing it would create more smoke, which they believed kept away biting insects or even evil spirits. We might roll our eyes now, but in that smoky haze, who could say what was real? Historians still argue whether this smoky strategy was purely superstition, or if it genuinely reduced pests that threatened food stores. You can almost taste the acrid smoke, see the sparks flying up toward the ragged hole in the roof. The hearth fire needs constant feeding logs, kindling, dung, anything flammable to keep the fragile warmth alive. Peasants spent half their day hunting for fuel because a dying fire meant a night of icy misery. The cold outside is merciless, but so is the smoke inside. The trade-off is survival, and while the hearth's glow pushes back the shadows, it also highlights the starkness of peasant life: bare floors, rough wooden furniture, and the thick, heavy air full of smoke and dampness. But this smoky refuge, imperfect as it is where the medieval peasant finds a fragile, flickering warmth against the coldest nights. You shrug into your threadbare cloak, the rough wool itching like it's made of tiny thorns, then pile on an animal pelt that smells faintly of barn and smoke. Layering up was the peasants' first defence against the cold, a patchwork armour of whatever they could scavenge, spin, or trade. Wool was king, though scratchy and sometimes infested with tiny bugs you'd rather not know about. Add some furs from the animals you raised or trapped: fox, rabbit, maybe even badger, and you've got yourself a survival outfit. You look ridiculous by modern standards, but this was the medieval equivalent of a thermal jacket. Medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of a closet full of fancy coats or insulating synthetics. Instead, their clothing was pieced together from what was at hand, often old, patched, and layered until the seams threatened to burst. Layers weren't just for warmth. They also helped block the biting wind that seeped through the cracks in stone and wood. Picture yourself wrapped in so many layers that you feel like a walking, mumbling marshmallow, barely able to bend your arms, but at least not freezing. Here's a quirky detail: some peasants believed that layering up with animal furs wasn't just practical, but also magical. Wearing a wolf pelt, for example, might grant you the wolf's endurance against cold or sharp senses in the dark. It's one of those fringe beliefs historians still debate whether it was mere superstition or had a deeper social or psychological purpose, like feeling braver in the harsh winter. The clothes weren't just worn on the body. Sometimes they were stuffed inside boots or wrapped around hands as improvised mittens. Remember that cold-fingered sensation from earlier? Those layers were your only barrier before frostbite crept in. But layering had its downsides. The more you wore, the heavier and clumsier you became. Moving through snowy fields or hauling wood got tougher by the minute. Still, better to be weighed down and warm than nimble and frozen solid. Colours were limited, mostly dull browns, greys, and off-whites, dyed with whatever plants grew nearby. Fashion was not the point here. Practicality was survival. Your outfit might stink from weeks without washing, but at least you weren't shivering through another night. So, you stand there, layered in a jumble of wool and fur, the rough textures pressing against your skin, the weight of winter all around you. This isn't a style statement. It's medieval cold armour, clunky, itchy, and utterly necessary. You shuffle into the cramped sleeping chamber, a room barely big enough for the whole family, and prepare to crawl under a patchwork blanket piled high with every scrap of cloth, animal fur, and leftover straw you can find. The cold outside has chased you here, and inside, huddling close is your only chance to survive. Peasants knew that in the biting medieval night. Warmth was a team effort. Shared breath and body heat the difference between shivering awake and deep sleep. The beds themselves were far from cozy. Think of a wooden frame supporting a thick pallet stuffed with straw, sometimes layered with wool or feathers if you were lucky. But in most cases, the mattresses were thin, rough, and prone to attracting every critter imaginable: lice, fleas, and the occasional mouse. Still, you pile in alongside your family, sharing the tiny space, your limbs tangled in a desperate embrace against the cold. Now, here's a strange medieval survival hack. It was common to invite animals into the bed with you. Dogs, cats, pigs, even goats might squeeze in for warmth. These furry companions weren't just pets. They were living hot water bottles, their body heat a precious commodity during frigid nights. You can imagine the odd smells and twitching paws, but better that than frostbite. Historians still debate the health implications of this practice. Some argue it increased disease risk, while others say the warmth and companionship outweighed the downsides. After all, in a world without central heating, you make peace with the smells and the bugs to stay alive. The room itself is barely insulated, thick stone or wattle, and daub walls offer little protection, and the single window is just a small opening shuttered with cloth or thin wood. You can hear the howling wind outside, the creak of frozen wood settling, and the distant bark of a dog that probably hates the cold as much as you do. As you settle in, your fingers and toes still tingling from the day's chill, the warmth from bodies pressed tight against yours starts to seep through. It's not luxury, but it's the closest thing to comfort you'll get tonight. You listen to the quiet snores and the occasional shifting of your animal bedmates, sharing a fragile peace forged by cold and companionship. So, as you close your eyes, remember medieval sleeping wasn't about space or softness. It was about heat, survival, and the strange but effective alliance of family and beast against the coldest, darkest nights. You wake to a chill that seeps even through your layered clothes and the tight huddle of your family's shared bed. The cold hasn't relented, and your stomach gnaws at you, winter's scarcity already tightening its grip. Food preservation is a quiet battle waged daily, because without modern refrigeration, keeping what little you have from spoiling through freezing nights and damp days requires clever tricks and constant vigilance. Medieval peasants relied on simple methods to make their food last. Root vegetables like turnips and carrots were stored in cool, dry cellars or buried in sand to keep from freezing solid and rotting. Meat, often scarce and precious, might be salted, smoked, or hung in cold but sheltered spaces, transforming the chill into a natural fridge. You can almost smell the smoky tang of preserved bacon hanging near the hearth, mingling with the acrid wood smoke. But here's a quirky fact in some northern villages. Peasants would store their root crops under layers of straw and snow, trusting the insulation of frost to protect their food. They'd even freeze fruits in outdoor pits, creating something like medieval ice boxes. Historians still argue whether these techniques were widespread or isolated to specific regions with harsher winters. Your diet this time of year is monotonous but functional porridge thick with barley, dark rye bread that tastes like a slab of cardboard, salted meat scraps, and whatever vegetables survived the autumn harvest. Fresh produce is a distant memory, and the cold keeps your cooking fires low to conserve fuel. So meals are often lukewarm at best. Water can be a problem too. Wells might freeze over, forcing you to melt snow or collect rainwater when you can. The risk of illness from contaminated water increases, so many turn to ale or weak beer, which, while not exactly a health tonic, is safer to drink and easier to keep warm. You remember hearing tales of clever preservation methods like burying food in peat bogs or packing fish in barrels with brine, but these were costly or complex, often beyond the means of the poorest peasants. They had to make do with what was simplest and most reliable. So, as you nibble on your scant meal beside the flickering hearth, you realize winter isn't just about enduring the cold. It's a constant negotiation with scarcity, rot, and the cruel clock of the seasons. Every preserved bite is a small victory in a long war of survival. You step outside again into the frozen village, where the chill bites sharper than before and every gust of wind feels like a blade slicing through your patched layers. The layout of the village itself wasn't random. It was a quiet defense against winter's worst. Houses huddle close, almost pressed together, their thick walls leaning into each other as if for mutual support against the biting cold and howling winds. Villages often positioned homes so that the narrow streets ran perpendicular to prevailing winds, creating natural windbreaks, stone walls, hedges, and even stacks of firewood were strategically placed to shield doorways and windows from icy drafts. These weren't just old-world quirks. They were essential design choices that helped reduce heat loss in a time when keeping warm was a matter of survival. You might spot small, low walls built of earth and timber around fields and homes, miniature fortresses against winter winds. In some areas, villagers planted dense hedgerows, not only to mark boundaries but also to act as living windbreaks. These green barricades cut down the bite of cold air and trapped snow in drifts where it could do less damage. Here's a lesser-known detail in some northern villages. Houses were partially dug into the earth, creating semi-subterranean homes that stayed warmer during freezing nights. Imagine crawling down a ladder into your winter bunker, where the ground's natural insulation was your shield. Historians still argue how common this was, and whether it was an ingenious adaptation or simply a quirk of isolated settlements. The village's compact design also made it easier to share warmth. Neighbours often leaned on each other, literally and figuratively, passing firewood, sharing food, or trading clothes. The social fabric was as vital as the physical layout in fending off winter's harshness. As you walk through the icy streets, you notice how sun angles matter too. Houses were often oriented to catch the low winter sun, the south-facing walls made thicker or window placement chosen to maximize every precious ray of heat. You can almost feel the sun's weak touch through the frost, a reminder that nature was both enemy and ally. So, village design wasn't just about order or tradition, it was a cold weather strategy, a communal blueprint drawn by necessity, shaping how peasants faced the merciless winter winds day after frozen day. You trudge through the village's muddy, snow-packed paths, each step a careful negotiation with slush and ice that cling to your boots like clingy mud monsters. Wet feet are the medieval peasants' nightmare cold. Soggy toes can quickly turn numb, and if you're unlucky, frostbite or even deadly infections could set in. So managing the constant battle against mud and snow was as critical as layering up or stoking the hearth. The problem is, roads were rarely paved. Dirt paths turned to thick mud when snow melted during the day. then froze solid by night. This cycle made walking treacherous, turning every journey into a slippery, slow ordeal. You grip a crude wooden staff or a walking stick for balance, the ruts and puddles ready to swallow your foot. To combat the worst of it, peasants used various hacks. Straw was strewn on paths near homes to absorb moisture and create a less slippery surface. Some villages laid down wooden planks or logs to make rudimentary corduroy roads over the worst boggy spots. You can imagine the smell of damp straw mixed with the unmistakable funk of mud and animal waste. Winter wasn't exactly a time for fresh air. Footwear was another challenge. Peasant shoes were usually made of leather, often thin and worn through by winter's end. To keep feet dry, some wrapped cloth or moss around their feet inside boots for extra insulation and moisture absorption. Others stuffed straw inside their shoes, which might sound cozy but could quickly become a soggy mess. Not exactly glamorous, but better than frozen toes. Here's a quirky tidbit in some colder regions. Peasants fashioned crude wooden clogs or overshoes, designed to keep feet above wet ground. They weren't easy to walk in and made a lot of noise, but they were surprisingly effective at keeping feet dry. Historians still debate how widespread clog use really was, whether it was a regional innovation or more common than records suggest. Your boots slosh and slip as you make your way back home. Each step a reminder that cold and wet are a double threat. Soaking your clothes means losing precious body heat faster. You learn to value dryness as much as warmth, because in the Middle Ages, soggy feet could be a death sentence. So, mud and snow weren't just minor annoyances, they were relentless, grinding enemies that shaped every step of a peasant's winter journey. You huddle close to the hearth once more, but tonight your thoughts drift to the role animals play in the peasant's cold weather survival, a quiet alliance between humans and beasts, built on mutual need and instinct. These animals aren't just livestock for meat or milk, they are essential companions, warmth sources, and sometimes even weather forecasters. Imagine a scrawny goat shivering next to the door or a loyal dog curled up at your feet. Peasants relied heavily on their animals' body heat during harsh winters, sometimes inviting them inside to stave off the cold. You'd think sharing a bed with a pig might be uncomfortable, but in the medieval mind, that was a small price to pay for the warmth that could save your life. Animals also had practical uses in winter's grip. Oxen and horses hauled firewood and carried heavy loads, their strength powering survival efforts. And animals themselves required care-feeding hay, sheltering them from the wind, and sometimes even borrowing their hides to make warmer clothing or bedding. The interconnectedness of peasant and animal life was a vital survival system. Here's a fun, if slightly odd, fact. Peasants sometimes believed their animals could sense impending storms or extreme cold, and might act nervously before harsh weather arrived. This led to a kind of informal weather forecasting based on animal behaviour, a medieval meteorology that was part superstition, part observation. Historians still debate how reliable this was or if it was simply a comforting myth. The animals weren't just practical assets, they were emotional anchors too. When the world outside is a frozen wilderness, having a warm, breathing companion in the room can be a source of comfort and sanity. You can almost hear the quiet snuffling of the dog and the occasional bleat of a goat as you settle in against the cold. So, as you reflect on the peasants' harsh winter nights, remember the warm bodies that shared their struggles and warmth. The line between human and animal survival blurred in those icy hours, a mutual fight against the cold that brought them close, literally and figuratively. You glance up at the frost-covered window, where the cold bites not just outside but sneaks through every crack, threatening the fragile warmth inside. Medieval peasants had to improvise clever ways to insulate their homes, tiny measures that made a huge difference when temperatures plummeted. Windows, when they existed, were often just small openings covered with oiled parchment, cloth, or thin sheets of animal horn. These materials let in some light but were far from airtight. Drafts slipped in, making the cold all the more brutal. To combat this, peasants hung heavy tapestries or blankets over doorways and windows, creating thick barriers to block the chill. Every scrap of fabric was precious in winter's siege. Some villagers stuffed moss, straw, or rags into cracks in walls or between wooden beams, forming crude insulation that trapped the precious heat inside. You can almost feel the slight warmth against your skin as you press your hand to a wall, sensing the thin boundary between cold and comfort. Here's a fringe tidbit in some northern regions. People used layers of fish skins or dried seaweed as insulating materials, thanks to their water-resistant properties. This odd practice puzzles historians. Did it come from necessity or cultural tradition? Historians still debate how widespread and effective these natural insulators really were. Fireplaces, when present, were improved over time with chimneys, but many peasants still relied on open hearths that let heat escape quickly. The placement of furniture and sleeping arrangements was strategic. Beds often lined walls away from drafts, and tables and stools clustered near the hearth's warmth. Every small choice mattered. As the cold wind howls outside, you can hear the faint creak of the wooden shutters and the whisper of snow sliding down the roof. You pull a blanket tighter, grateful for the layers of warmth but aware that the fight against winter's cold is never fully won. In this fragile balance of drafts and insulation, the medieval peasant's home is a patchwork fortress, equal parts ingenuity, necessity, and stubborn hope against the endless winter nights. You step outside before dawn, the icy air sharp in your lungs and frost crunching beneath your boots like shattered glass. The cold here isn't just a nuisance, it's a relentless force shaping every moment of your day, demanding ingenuity to secure even the basics of survival. Fetching water is a perilous task. Wells often freeze over, and frozen ponds mean you must chip away ice or melt snow for your daily supply. Imagine the bitter chill as you break the ice, the water slushing cold and slow into your bucket, each drop a small victory against winter's grip. To keep water from freezing indoors, peasants placed buckets near the hearth or carried out daily routines during the warmer midday hours, storing water in wooden barrels, sometimes wrapped in cloth, helped slow the freeze, but the struggle was constant. Water scarcity in winter was as real as the cold itself. An odd yet practical trick was to hang water containers from the ceiling inside the cottage. The warmer air near the roof helped prevent freezing, but this required skill to avoid spills and breakage. Historians still debate how common and effective these ceiling-hung containers were across medieval Europe. Food preparation also shifted in winter. You cook over low fires to conserve fuel, often using clay pots that retain heat longer. Stews simmer slowly, blending whatever roots, salted meat, or dried herbs you have. The kitchen is a smoky, cramped space, and cooking smells mingle with the dampness, creating a thick, heavy atmosphere. Here's a fringe belief some peasants thought: that cooking certain herbs or spices over the fire could ward off winter illnesses or evil spirits lurking in the cold darkness. Whether this was true or mere superstition, it added a small ritualistic comfort to the dreary days. As the village slowly wakes, You feel the weight of winter pressing down. The cold isn't just a backdrop, but a force shaping routines, relationships, and survival itself. Every chore becomes a negotiation with the cold, every small success a glimmer of hope. You tuck your hands closer to the fire, fingers stiff and cracked from the cold, and think about the medieval peasant's most crucial winter tool, the hearth. This wasn't just a place to cook, it was the heart of survival, warmth, and community, a flickering fortress against the darkness and chill. The hearth was often a simple stone or clay pit built into the centre or side of the main room, where wood, peat, or charcoal burned low and steady. Unlike modern fireplaces with chimneys, many medieval homes had open hearths that let smoke curl through a hole in the roof or seep out cracks, making the air smoky and eyes water. Yet, it was worth it. Fire was life. You can almost smell the mix of wood smoke and burning peat, the scent that clung to clothes and skin like a badge of winter's struggle. Keeping the fire alive required constant tending, adding small logs or kindling, carefully balancing flames to last through the night without burning the precious fuel too fast. Here's a quirky medieval fact in some regions. Peasants would toss dried herbs or even bits of straw into the fire to produce pleasant scents or to mask the smoky smell. This wasn't just for comfort, it was believed to keep away illnesses or evil spirits that thrived in the cold darkness. Historians still debate how much of this was superstition and how much was practical medicine. Besides heat, the hearth was a social hub. Families gathered around, sharing stories, repairing clothes, or spinning wool by the flickering light. The fire's warmth was shared generously, a rare comfort in a cold world. Fireplace construction varied widely. Some wealthier peasants had chimneys to channel smoke out efficiently, while poorer villagers dealt with smoky rooms and coughing fits. But no matter the design, the hearth was always sacred, a lifeline to warmth, food, and human connection in the darkest season. So, as you lean closer to the flames, feeling the heat press against your chilled skin, remember in medieval winter, fire was more than flame. It was hope, home, and the fragile glow that kept the cold at bay. You feel the weight of the woolen cloak around your shoulders, coarse yet essential, as you step out into the grey dawn. Clothing in the medieval winter was a patchwork armour against cold, pieced together from whatever you could scavenge, mend, or trade. For peasants, warmth wasn't a luxury, it was a battle fought layer by layer. Most garments were made from wool, linen, or animal hides. Wool was prized for its insulating qualities and its ability to keep warmth close even when damp. You can almost feel the rough texture against your skin, itchy yet comforting, like a prickly shield. Peasants layered tunics, cloaks, and hoods, fastening each with simple wooden or bone pins, a fringe detail. Some peasants lined their cloaks with feathers or straw to add insulation. While this sounds odd today, it was an effective way to trap air and slow heat loss. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or limited to certain colder regions, but it certainly shows the ingenuity in their approach. You notice that footwear was just as critical. Thick leather boots, often crudely stitched and worn through, were stuffed with straw or wool for warmth and dryness. Some villagers made use of felted wool slippers indoors to keep frostbite at bay. Dye and decoration were rare luxuries. Most clothing was a dull palette of browns, greys, and muted greens colours that concealed dirt and wear. Repair was constant. A torn sleeve or worn patch was fixed repeatedly, a testament to thrift and necessity. Here's a curious tidbit in some areas. Peasants believed that wearing certain colours or patterns could ward off cold or illness, a blend of superstition and practical advice passed down through generations. Historians still debate how much of medieval clothing choices were driven by utility versus cultural beliefs. So, as you bundle up against the chill, remember the layers you wear are more than fabric. They're a survival strategy, woven with centuries of experience and a stubborn refusal to succumb to winter's bite. You crouch low by the fire, warming your numb fingers as the wind rattles the shutters outside. Your mind drifts to the peasants' nighttime rituals, small, often overlooked moments that made the coldest nights bearable, even if just barely. The way they prepared to sleep wasn't just about comfort. It was about outsmarting the freeze that could seep into bones and dreams alike. Beds were humble, often nothing more than wooden frames stuffed with straw or rushes. You can almost feel the scratchy, uneven surface beneath your thin blanket, a far cry from any modern mattress. Yet, peasants layered thick woolen blankets or animal furs to trap warmth. The use of shared beds was common not just for family closeness, but because a dozen bodies pooled heat better than one. A quirky medieval fact in some colder villages: people would place heated stones wrapped in cloth under their blankets to ward off the chill. These bed warmers were carefully handled to avoid burns, but gave precious, slow-releasing heat through the long, freezing nights. Historians still debate the prevalence and effectiveness of these early heat packs. Before settling down, families often performed small rituals to protect against nightmares or evil spirits, thought to roam more freely in winter's dark. Simple prayers, the burning of protective herbs by the hearth, or the placement of certain talismans near the bed were believed to keep the cold and darkness at bay. Sleep itself was often segmented. The long winter nights sometimes meant peasants woke after a few hours, tending the fire or checking on livestock, then drifting back to sleep. Historians still argue whether this segmented sleep was a widespread medieval pattern or a romanticized interpretation of old habits. You sense the faint smell of smoke mingling with the dampness and the steady, comforting breathing of your family nearby. The cold presses outside, but inside this modest room, shared warmth and quiet routines form a fragile shield against the night. So, as you nestle into your scratchy bedding, know that every small act, the shared heat, the prayers whispered in the dark, is part of a larger dance with winter's long, cold grip. You step out into the bleak morning, the world coated in frost and silence. Winter in medieval times wasn't just a season. It was a slow, grinding trial that shaped every aspect of peasant life, even their food. Surviving the cold meant more than just warmth. It meant making every calorie count and turning scarce resources into meals that could keep the body going through months of darkness and chill. Fresh vegetables were nearly impossible to grow in winter, so peasants relied heavily on preserved foods. Root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and carrots stored in root cellars or buried in straw became staples. These cellars, dug into the earth or built beneath homes, maintained a steady, cool temperature that kept food from freezing solid or spoiling too fast. You can almost smell the earthy scent of root vegetables and stored apples, the only fresh tastes amid the dull winter diet. Meat was a rare treat, often salted, smoked, or dried to last through winter months. Hunting was difficult in deep snow, and live animals required too much scarce feed, so preserved meat, sometimes tough and salty, were rationed carefully, shared sparingly at family tables. Here's a little-known fact: some peasants stored small live fish in underground pools or cisterns, a medieval form of refrigeration that kept fish fresh for longer periods. This practice puzzles historians who still debate how widespread or successful it really was. Brewing beer or ale was also vital, especially since water was often unsafe or frozen. These drinks provided calories, warmth, and a morale boost, sometimes the only liquid warmth during bitter days. Interestingly, medieval beer was much weaker than today's versions, often a nutritious staple rather than a strong alcoholic treat. Historians continue to debate the nutritional adequacy of the peasant winter diet. Some argue it was barely enough to maintain health, while others suggest it provided sufficient calories but lacked diversity, contributing to winter illnesses. So, as you sit by the fire with a bowl of hearty stew, remember that every bite was part of a careful balancing act, an ancient recipe for survival in the coldest months. You watch as the pale sun struggles to rise, casting long shadows on the frozen fields outside. Winter meant months of little daylight, forcing peasants to shift their routines around the dim, short days. Without electric lights or even reliable candles, the rhythm of life slowed dramatically, marked by the sun's fleeting presence and the flickering glow of the hearth. Peasants maximized the brief daylight hours for essential tasks: feeding animals, chopping firewood, repairing tools, and then retreated indoors as dusk fell early, sometimes before 4 p.m. in northern regions. The evening stretched long and cold, filled with simple but necessary activities like spinning wool, mending clothes, or quietly telling stories to keep spirits alive. Here's a fun historical note: candle making was often a communal affair, with families rendering animal fat into tallow candles. These candles weren't bright by modern standards, casting a dim, flickering light that strained the eyes. Interestingly, beeswax candles were considered a luxury, mostly reserved for churches or wealthy homes. Historians still debate how much artificial light peasants realistically had during the deepest winter months. Because of limited light, peasants adapted their sleep patterns too, sometimes dividing sleep into 2 segments: an early sleep after dusk and a second sleep before dawn. This practice, debated among scholars, might have been a natural response to darkness and cold rather than a strict tradition. The long nights also amplified feelings of isolation and hardship. To combat this, community gatherings, simple feasts, dances, or religious observances became vital social lifelines. Even in the cold, peasants found ways to connect, reminding each other that no matter how long the night, morning always comes. So as you sit in your dimly lit room, surrounded by quiet shadows, imagine the medieval peasant embracing the short days and long nights with a mixture of fatigue, resilience, and a stubborn flicker of hope. You huddle against the cold stone walls of the village church, a place of refuge not only for your spirit, but for your very survival during winter's harshest nights. For medieval peasants, faith was a powerful companion against the chill, both a source of comfort and a communal gathering point that helped endure the long, dark months. Churches, though often cold and drafty themselves, offered shelter during blizzards or extreme weather. Sometimes villagers would spend nights there when their own homes were too exposed or unsafe. The flickering candlelight and the faint smell of incense created a solemn warmth amid the biting cold, a contrast to the harshness outside. Religious observances during winter were vital for maintaining morale. Saints' days and feast days broke the monotony and despair, offering moments of celebration and ritual warmth. Prayers for protection against the cold, sickness, and famine were common, reflecting the deep intertwining of spirituality and survival. Here's an intriguing fact: some medieval churches were built with heated floors or walls, early forms of underfloor heating using channels for warm air. This was rare and typically limited to wealthier parishes, but it shows the ingenuity applied to combating winter cold in sacred spaces. Historians still debate how effective these systems were and how widespread their use became. Superstitions around winter and faith were abundant. Some peasants believed certain blessings or relics could protect homes from freezing, or that spirits could be appeased to bring warmth. These beliefs sometimes blurred lines between religion and folklore, a fertile ground for ongoing scholarly debate. As you stand beneath the towering arches, hearing the faint echo of distant prayers, you feel the mingling of cold and hope, how faith, like fire, kindled light in the darkest season, warming bodies and souls alike. You wrap your cloak tighter as the winter wind gnaws at your exposed face, thinking about how medieval peasants coped with sickness during the cold months. Illness in winter wasn't just inconvenient, it was potentially deadly. The chill made bodies vulnerable, and the scarcity of fresh food and clean water only worsened health. Medieval medicine was a patchwork of herbal remedies, superstition, and early scientific ideas. Peasants often relied on homegrown herbs like sage, thyme, and chamomile, brewing them into teas or poultices to ease coughs and fevers. The smell of these bitter brews filled smoky huts, mingling with the ever-present scent of wood smoke. Here's a curious tidbit: some believed that rubbing a mixture of animal fats and crushed herbs on the chest could ward off the evil cold. Others thought certain crystals or amulets had healing power, worn as protection against winter illnesses. Historians still debate how effective these remedies were versus their placebo effect or cultural comfort. Poor nutrition, cramped living conditions, and cold drafts made peasants particularly susceptible to respiratory infections and frostbite. When sickness struck, care was mostly provided by family members or local healers, often blending folk medicine with religious prayers. Interestingly, the church sometimes played a dual role, both as a place of healing through prayers and as a source of fear, with illness sometimes seen as a divine punishment or the work of evil spirits. This complicated how peasants approached treatment, blending hope and dread. Despite the hardships, winter illnesses were a powerful motivator for the development of some early public health ideas: quarantines during outbreaks, and improved hygiene practices in villages. Yet historians still argue how widespread and effective these measures really were. So, as you blow warm breath into your cold hands, remember that medieval peasants fought not just the cold itself, but the invisible enemies winter invited, using every tool herbal, spiritual, or hopeful to survive. You step cautiously over a thin sheet of ice near the village well, the sharp crunch beneath your feet echoing in the frozen air. Water so vital yet so treacherous in winter was one of the harshest challenges peasants faced during the coldest nights and days. Frozen streams, wells choked with ice, and snow that needed melting made this basic necessity a constant struggle. Peasants adapted by using ingenious methods to keep water flowing. Some heated stones in the fire and dropped them into buckets or barrels to melt ice. A dangerous game of balancing warmth without breaking fragile containers. Others made well covers out of wood and straw to insulate water sources, slowing the freeze. A quirky medieval fact in some regions. People believed that dropping certain herbs or small charms into wells could prevent freezing or purify water. Historians still debate how these practices reflect a mix of practical knowledge and superstition. but they highlight the importance peasants placed on clean water access. Storing melted snow indoors was common, but it had to be used quickly to avoid refreezing. This meant frequent trips outside in the bitter cold, each risking frostbite and exhaustion. The importance of water for cooking, cleaning, and drinking made these trips a daily ordeal. Interestingly, some villages developed early community water sharing systems during winter, pooling resources to reduce the number of dangerous trips. This communal approach also fostered social bonds that helped villages survive the hardest months. As you watch your breath cloud the icy air, you realize how every drop of water was precious, fought for in the freeze, a vital thread in the fragile tapestry of winter survival. You stare into the blackened sky as a storm brews, snowflakes already swirling in the cold wind. Winter storms could be deadly for medieval peasants, threatening not just comfort but survival. These fierce tempests tested every ounce of preparation and grit, turning the familiar landscape into a frozen wilderness overnight. Villages prepared by reinforcing thatched roofs with extra straw and mud, patching cracks in walls with clay, and stacking firewood close at hand. Everyone helped secure livestock in sheltered barns or makeshift pens, understanding that losing animals meant losing vital food and warmth. You can almost hear the anxious chatter, the hurried footsteps on frozen ground as neighbours band together against the coming fury. A lesser-known fact, some peasants built low windbreak walls around their homes and fields from piled stones or bundled brush to reduce snowdrifts and shield their homes from biting gusts. Historians still argue how common these windbreaks were, but their logic is undeniable. During storms, villagers often gathered indoors, sharing what little warmth the hearth provided, sometimes staying awake through the night to stoke fires or check on the weak. The cold was a living presence, pressing in on every corner, but shared resilience created a fragile shield. Surviving a storm was as much about mental toughness as physical preparation. Tales and songs of past winters were shared to bolster courage and remind everyone that spring, however distant, would eventually return. As the first heavy snowflakes settle on your cloak, you feel the pulse of the storm's challenge, a brutal test that shaped every frozen night and steeled the hearts of those who lived through it. The long winter finally loosens its grip, and the first tentative signs of spring flicker through the frost-bitten fields. You feel the promise of warmth creeping back into the air, a slow thaw that signals the end of endless cold nights and the return of life to the village. After months of survival tactics, layered clothing, shared hearth warmth, preserved food, and endless perseverance, the coming season is a reward earned through hardship. Peasants emerge from their homes, rubbing frost from tired eyes, ready to tend fields and prepare for planting. The earth is still hard and wet, but hope rises with the sun. Some peculiar traditions mark this transition. Villagers would scatter ashes from the hearth outside to fertilize soil, believing that the fire's protective spirit would nurture new growth. Historians still debate whether this was widespread or symbolic, but it highlights the deep connection peasants felt with the cycles of nature. Communal celebrations, like early spring festivals or simple feasts, reinforced bonds and marked the shift from survival to renewal. These gatherings were vital after months of isolation, a joyful release from winter's oppressive hold. As you breathe in the crisp air, tinged with thawing earth and budding life, you understand that the medieval peasant's winter was more than just a season. It was a test of endurance, ingenuity, and community spirit. And now, As you prepare to leave this world behind for a while, remember that those cold, long nights shaped more than just history. They shaped resilience and the unbreakable human will to survive.